Hey Professor, so this video presentation is going to be on race and the juvenile justice system. This is just a little background information on the juvenile justice system, and it began during the Progressive Era and was pushed by reformers, one famously known as Jane Addams. I will be going through a little timeline of how it all came to be. So starting off in the colonial era, they were literally no joke. In 1640, laws were harsh on anybody, including children. At this time, a crime and offense was just that, regardless of the age of the person committing it. So a minor would actually be charged as an adult. And in Massachusetts, the Stubborn Child Act was made so that a child's disobedience would be a criminal offense, and they were actually permitted the death penalty option for them. But then the 19th century came and the idea emerged that children should be taken care of by the state. And that's when the term parents patriarch came to light, its purpose being to use this concept to protect the state's right to formally intervene in a juvenile's life, especially if the minor was offending laws or being neglected. Now in 1825, the New York House of Refuge opened. Now this was the first institution in the United States for troubled kids. This reformatory's purpose was to deal with delinquency as a special problem. Its programs were strictly on the detention, education, and rehabilitation of juvenile delinquency. Fast forwarding to 1899, the first ever juvenile court was created. Chicago reformists, aka child savers, are credited for the first juvenile court opening in Illinois. They really pushed for one and got it because they believed that if a delinquent was properly supported, they wouldn't turn into lifelong criminals. Reformists wanted a place where adults and minors would be tried separately and on complete different terms, which is why this court was very private. It was done behind closed doors with the judge and the child, most of the time in an office-like setting. There was no parents, prosecutors, or counsel present, and the punishment was always considered as being sent to a reformatory institution so the juvenile can get rehabilitated. Now, by the 1920s, every state in the country had adopted a separate court for minors. Finally, a place where children can be looked at as children. But of course, there's always a catch. Things weren't the same for colored children, and that was because under the Jim Crow laws, it made it so that racial segregation could be legally enforced. Now, unfortunately, this was a part of our history, and oftentimes colored children will be banned from houses of refuge and even be placed in adult prisons. It was obviously a time where color determined everything. It didn't matter if you were 5 years old on the street or 50. If you were black, that's it. Luckily, though, after World War II, people began to fight for liberty and justice, and that's when the Civil Rights Movement came to be. So 1967 was the year that pretty much changed everything for the juvenile justice system. And that was thanks to the Gerald Galt case, which caused federal laws to permanently change for minors. So long story short, Gerald was arrested at 15 years old for making prank phone calls to his neighbor. His parents were not only unaware of his arrest, but they weren't granted their rights at all. Gerald never saw a judge and within a week was sent to an all-boys training school until he was 21, just for that phone call. His case was clearly not properly dealt with, and now that the Supreme Court reformed the laws, the state must respect all legal rights that are owed to a person, regardless of their age. Now passing by to what was the best, but again the worst decades, here we are in the late 70s and early 90s. During this time, crime was increasing at a ridiculous rate, which meant that laws were pushed and made harsher, especially for juveniles. The New York City Juvenile Offender Act meant that once again, a minor could be charged as an adult, and on top of that be given the death penalty for violent crimes like murder, assault, and robberies. So then the term super predators emerged, and delinquents were characterized to be just that. Ruthless and sociopathic juveniles with no moral conscience whatsoever. This led to the acceptance of extreme sentencing for juveniles. Overall, many young men were executed for crimes they committed as minors. So now we're in a whole new century, the world didn't end, and we somehow made it to the 2000s. And once again, the Supreme Court has to intervene with juvenile justice system policies for obvious reasons. The High Court made it so that law enforcement officers take into consideration not only the age but the circumstances of the juvenile, like the minor's background, mentality, maturity level, and they also had to make very coherent the rights they had as a person. The Supreme Court wanted to illuminate the fact that just because a person was a minor did not mean they did not have the same rights as an adult. law enforcement officers were to reiterate the juvenile's Miranda rights as much as needed and fully make sure they understood their rights and what was going to happen before proceeding interrogation. The United States incarcerates more juveniles than any other country in the world, and race always seems to be the center of attention when regarding it. Juvenile incarceration is obviously not as bad as how it used to be. However, there is a disproportionate rate between the amount of white juveniles that get arrested and Black or Latino, which is why in many states race laws were placed so there wouldn't be any unfair treatment. These laws made it so that racial impact statements would be made, committees would be able to address racial and ethnic disparities, cultural competency training for law enforcement officers would be enforced, standardized data collection would be made, and race-neutral risk assessments would be assessed. Now going into the case that really pisses America off. It exhibits the negative outcomes of the juvenile justice system, and that's the Khalif Browder case. By now, we all pretty much know what happened to him. So at 15 years old, he was arrested for allegedly stealing a backpack. There was no actual proof whatsoever, and it was all just circumstantial. But those circumstances and allegation stole 3 years of his life. Throughout his stay at Rikers, he was not only physically and verbally abused by guards and inmates, but was left emotionally traumatized. It is very evident that he was targeted because he was a young Black male, and because everything he went through. 2 years after being released from jail, he committed suicide. This is the ultimate case that shows just how badly the juvenile system can fail a minor, but unfortunately is one of millions. And for that reason is why there are people in this world who dedicate their entire lives to find solutions for these kinds of problems. And one way to better the juvenile justice system is through the restorative justice approach. So this is the child's alternative to having criminal prosecution against them. This approach is done to rehabilitate the juvenile through cognitive therapy with their victims or with their own conflicts rather than having them incarcerated and placing criminal charges against them. It's evident that the overall juvenile justice system does not effectively protect the youth's public safety when in these detentionary institutions. Not only that, but the psyche of the juvenile can be seriously affected by the prison-like experience, which is why the goal is always to make incarceration the very last resort. In this research study made by McCarthy, Schiraldi, and Shark proves just how ineffective juvenile incarceration really is. And so Vincent Schiraldi oriented his focus on taking the 4 R's action steps, which was reduce, reform, replace, and reinvest. Using the 4 R's can significantly influence the justice system to be more open to the idea of always investing in a juvenile, the idea of never giving up on a minor, and to distance themselves from the perception that sending them to detention centers is going to better their mentalities or make them learn their lesson. Another alternative to bettering the system is through the juvenile detention reform. Again, this reform is placed to make juvenile incarceration the very last resort, only if it's absolutely necessary. Now, obviously, there are going to be some cases where confinement is necessary for some juveniles, but a large chunk of the time it's really not. And an option to avoid juvenile detention is through risk assessment requirements. States like New Jersey, New York, Nebraska, Colorado, Georgia, Kentucky, and Maryland have followed through with the risk assessments and have analyzed the juvenile's level of risk and individual treatments needed. Now, including supervised releasement programs as an alternative to juvenile detention helps maintain the minor accountable for their responsibilities. It's a much more lenient approach and allows the juvenile to still have a decent adolescence. Now, going on to the Collaborative Family Initiative, it ensures that juveniles won't go through the rehabilitating phase alone and will have the support and encouragement from their families or linked ties that they obviously need. This allows their psychological needs to be treated as soon as possible rather than letting them be. And finally, life transition programs are also a great alternative to juvenile detention. This approach targets youths who have had really bad school attendance and is or was below the average grade level. It's a significant investment in minors who are very likely to enter state facilities and is used as a last chance type of resort. It's sort of the barrier between going to jail or being rehabilitated. It not only promotes early career exploration and helps keep juvenile out of the streets and trouble, it also allows them to continue working with the same community-based organizations. Giving all of these points, the juvenile justice system is not perfect. In fact, It's nowhere near perfect or even great, but it has evidently come a long way, and its policies are moving forward rather than backward. Advocates who fight for bettering the juvenile justice system isn't so that a juvenile will never ever get punished for what they do. In fact, they should get punished, but there's always a reason behind all their lash outs or behavior problems. We live in a broken world with broken people in it, and that's including children. When you think of the juvenile justice system, the first thing to pop in your head is not a white kid getting detained. It's a black or Latino kid. No one needs to say it because it's so obvious. The fact that policies have had to be implemented into a system in order to prevent racial discrimination says a lot about the world we live in. It's crazy how minors can be treated so differently just because of their color. It's like some things will never change. But luckily, things are getting a lot better.